Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut Global Security Forum 2020. Battlefronts, new and emerging threats, challenges, and opportunities to global security. Each year at the Global Security Forum, we explore the world's most critical security issues that impact our nation and our world. And this year, we're virtual, allowing more people from around the nation and around the world to join us, as well as our partners from World Affairs Councils around the country. So welcome, everyone. I am Megan Torrey, the CEO of the World Affairs Council of Connecticut, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our noon session today on U.S. security allies. Already this week during the Global Security Forum, we have heard from General Hoganson, the new chief of the National Guard Bureau, Dr. Richard Haas, and this morning from Ambassador Kurt Volker, all of whom have emphasized the need for maintaining and strengthening our relationships with our allies and our partners around the world. And that makes this session today of such critical importance. The format for today will be an interactive discussion between Major General Jones and some of our closest allies on this highly decorated panel. And without any further ado, I want to introduce you to our moderator for today's panel, General Michael Jones, who is a trusted friend and ally to the World Affairs Council. Take it away, General Jones.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome to all the attendees today. I'm really honored to be able to moderate this panel. I'm hoping, and I'm pretty sure I'll have an easier time than Chris Wallace did last night. I think we'll have a much more collaborative discussion. And I want to thank the Connecticut World Affairs Council, the Military Officers Association of America, and all of the partners who are part of this year's Global Security Forum and have made this happen. And I know I speak for everyone when I say we're grateful for forums like this, but at the same time, we look for the opportunity next year to meet in person and to be able to have lots of conversations with each other. So our subject today is security alliances, and I want to expand that a little bit to include coalitions and partnerships, because in some circles, alliances has a very technical meaning. And so we really want to talk about the way in which folks really operate in today's world, which includes alliances, but also includes a variety of coalitions and partnerships. Just to set the scene at Central Command, when I was there, we had 57 coalition partners who were stationed there in Tampa with us. I know General Ormsby was also in Tampa and worked a lot with those coalition partners. And alliances and coalitions have actually been the way in which military forces, or at least certainly US military forces, have operated for over a century. In the United States, it's a unilateral operation has become the rare exception to the rule. And I think it's probably reasonable to assume that coalitions and alliances and partnerships are probably the most likely way that we'll continue to operate in the future. So today we want to examine the subject of military alliances and partnerships and coalitions in the context of 4 of our most valued partners. So we're joined by a distinguished group of representatives of 4 very important countries to us. First of all, from our neighbor to the north, Canada, we have Major General Ormsby of the Royal Canadian Air Force, who is the Canadian Defense Attaché to Washington. From the UK, we have Dr. Peter Abbott, who is the British Consul General to New England. From New Zealand, we have Commodore David Gibbs from the Royal New Zealand Navy, who's New Zealand's Defense Attaché to the United States. And then finally, last but not least, from Australia, Major General Andrew Freeman, who is from the Australian Army and Australian Defense Attaché to the United States. So in the interest of time, I won't go through the biographies of all of our distinguished guests. You do have the ability, I believe, to click on their bios, and I certainly encourage you to do that to see the kind of distinguished service and accomplishments each of them have. So let's start in very broad terms, if I could, and I'll set up the first question, which is, in the United States, security strategy has four objectives: to protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life, to promote American prosperity, to preserve peace through strength, and to advance American influence. So my first question to our panel is, could each of you briefly describe what your country's national security objectives are, so we can understand the context of how you might approach alliances and conditions? So let's start off with General Freeman from Australia.
Good afternoon, Mike, and to everyone else out there. It's actually a pleasure to be here as part of this forum, and to have the Five Eyes community per se here. When you talk about alliances, I think it's very appropriate, so I look forward to the discussion. So what are Australia's national security objectives? You know, you just highlighted the US ones, and there's no surprise there. And I think if we can reflect on all those to align with their own countries, you know, national interests and self-defense as well. But what Australia's just done recently, as in last 1st of July it was, we just released a defence strategic update and a force posture plan. These are two key documents, and they're the foundation of our strategic view going forward. We have a white paper that was released in 2016, and this defence update, strategic update, is exactly that. It's an update, and the question is, why do we do an update, I think? And the answer to that is, the environment has changed a lot in the last 4 years. The environment that we operate in, Indo-Pacific region, has changed significantly since our white paper. That's why we did the update. And what I mean by that is strategic competition. That is primarily between the US and China. That is a driver, a strategic driver, and has a dynamic effect in our region. Likewise, major powers in the region are becoming more assertive. And again, as an example, China building military bases on islands. That's assertiveness. There's coercive activities in the region, you know, espionage, interference, economic levers being used, rules, norms, and international and global institutions are under strain. And there's emerging disruptive technologies and expanding cyber capabilities in the region. So the point there is, for Australia, and I'd say the wider Indo-Pacific region, the environment has changed significantly over the past 3-4 years. So as a result, with our strategic update, we've identified 3 strategic national security objectives. And the first being is shape, the second being deter, and the third being respond. So when we say shape, you know, what we're saying there is, and this goes to your point about alliances, we identify that we need to be more active and assertive in the region to promote stability, security, and sovereignty of not only ourselves, but our near region, and build that confidence in the region. And to achieve this, we see that we need to be, like I said, out more so in our partners or our countries around our immediate neighbourhood, and build those partnerships and strengthen existing partnerships. So that's the shape aspect. The second objective is deter. Now, historically, Australia's had a very much a self-defence, a defensive military posture. We've been able to deploy overseas and support others, but defensively is how we've been postured. Well, we've now rethought that and said we need to be a bit more capability and self-reliance, and to deliver a deterrence effect. Now, we're not going nuclear. You know, US is our strong ally partner, and that is our nuclear deterrence. But what we're talking about is that we need to be able to hold our adversary further away from our shores. We need to be able to reach out further and strike their infrastructure and their forces at a greater distance. So you'll see with Australia, we're now investing in long-range strike weapons, cyber capabilities, and aerial denial and like systems. So that's the deter strategic objective. And the third and final is our respond. Now, we need to be able to better be prepared for a conflict. I'm not saying there's going to be one, but we always are and should be prepared. and not just to work in our region, but also to support other partners and allies that are also under threat or need our support. Now, to develop this or to achieve this objective, again, partnerships are important, but it's also building up our resilience in our supply chain, our industry base, but also increasing our independence with countries like US and other allies in more assured agreements to make sure that our supply lines and their supply lines are sustained should there be a response needed. So I'll just summarise our three, obviously, shape, deter and respond.
Great, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that. Commodore Gibbs, can you give us kind of the New Zealand take on your national security objectives?
Well, certainly as a smaller nation, but maybe small in size, but certainly from a national security objectives, what we do is we take a whole of government approach. So you will see that the contributors to the national security environment in New Zealand extend beyond the immediate effects of the security agencies, defence, intelligence, and others. And we consider our environmental ministries, foreign affairs, health and education as all strong contributors to the national security construct. In terms of those overarching objectives, really strong parallels clearly with Australia in terms of the actual objectives and yourselves. Public safety, sovereignty and territorial integrity, sea lines of communication, into the rules-based order, economic prosperity, the support and maintenance of our own and regional and international democratic institutions and national values, and protecting the natural environment. And that will come through in a number of answers to some of your future questions, I think, that I'll be giving you today. But in terms of those national security objectives, they must be taken into consideration of how New Zealand views the strategic environment. And we have seen, and we released a strategic policy statement document in mid-2018, which I would certainly refer the attendees here today to look at. It's part of a three-pronged approach. The other two supporting plans being a climate action strategy and a capability plan. And those are publicly available online for all to refer to. But in terms of that challenge to the rules-based order, we're seeing challenges to open democratic societies in the region and globally. We're seeing actors pursue and wish to increase their spheres of influence. And the world is becoming broadly more complex, and the complex disruptors that we're particularly focused on in New Zealand are clearly the climate, both for ourselves and the region, forays into space, the challenges of cyber, and the ongoing threat of terrorism.
Great, thank you very much.
And one final thing, I would just like to thank yourselves and Connecticut generally for the opportunity to talk to this.
Great, thank you. Dr. Abbott, how about giving us the UK perspective?
Great, thank you very much, General, and thank you very much to the Connecticut World Affairs Council for putting this on today. I'm very conscious that on this extremely illustrious panel, I am the only civilian, so I hope all of our audience will forgive me for that. I think it was Lenin that said there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And I think we probably all agree that the last 6 or 7 months have been a period of extraordinary change. Coronavirus presents, I think, the greatest global challenge possibly since the end of World War II. Some experts estimate it will take about 2 years for our health to get back to normal, 5 years for our economies to get back to normal, 20 years for geopolitics to get back to normal or to adapt to the new reality. So I think there are huge consequences for the way that we work, the way that we live, the way that we cooperate internationally. COVID's been a real reminder of the kind of the interconnectedness of our world. And I think there will be, and as one of my colleagues has already mentioned, a tendency perhaps for the world to want to become more local, more national, less global, more protectionist, more trying to make sure that each nation is able to protect its own interests. And I think we want to, we want to avoid this. And I think it's up to alliances like the one represented here to challenge that. In the UK right now, we are in the middle of what we call an integrated review, and that is looking at the full suite of our foreign policy, security, defence, development and national resilience capabilities. So that review is ongoing, so I wouldn't want to sort of prejudge the outcome of that, but I just wanted to talk about some of the trends that review is looking at, because it's predicated on the idea that we cannot set out our global national security objectives without really understanding what is happening in the world. And I'm just going to go through this very quickly, but I think it's interesting, and I think some of my colleagues have already mentioned some of these a few moments ago. The rise of China, I think, is clearly very important. By 2050, it could be 20% of the global economy will be Chinese. Strategic threats, we've seen Russia use Novichok again recently, and these kind of threats from hostile states like Russia, but also serious organized crime from the Western Balkans, illegal migration, terrorism from the Sahel, Middle East. And I'm quite a fan of the Gerasimov doctrine, which I'm sure you all know about, this kind of idea of total war, where war is completely asymmetric and hybrid and happening on social media as much as on the battlefield. The fourth industrial revolution, the fusion of tech, blurring the lines between all of the different disciplines that we are used to. We've mentioned artificial intelligence, quantum, hypersonics, robotics. It's one of the things that makes New England and Boston in particular a really fascinating place to be, because there's so much work on this happening here. Demography is the fourth challenge that we're looking at. Global population set to increase by 2 billion by 2050. Environmental stresses and climate. And then there's a moral crisis as well that started with Me Too, has moved through to Black Lives Matter, and a general loss of trust in our institutions. So that's some of the really sort of the challenging macro themes that the integrated review is looking at. And I think the sort of conclusion of that review will be along the lines of the fusion doctrine, which says that every nation needs to try and use all of its tools at its disposal. So the UK's defence budget is the fifth largest in the world, the largest defence budget in Europe. So we'll be using that. We'll be using our economic clout, our diplomatic and intelligence clout, and our soft power, of course, the English language, culture, sport, arts, higher education, pulling all of that together into one sort of single overarching approach. I think that's enough for now. We'll come to more in the questions, but thank you.
Great, thank you, Pete. And then in somebody who I think has definitely a unique perspective on coalitions and alliances, especially having served as deputy commander of NORAD, I'd like to ask from Canada for General Ormsby to make his comments.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the Council again for inviting us. And I was honored to serve in NORAD. It was the deputy commander of the continental NORAD region in the United States where I served, and not in Colorado Springs, but certainly it shaped my views. I wasn't going to have a quotation, but since Dr. Abbott threw one down, I'm going to throw one down too. Back in 1925, Canada's representative to the League of Nations was a gentleman named Benoit Dandurand. And he said that Canada is a flame-proof house that lives far from the source of ignition. That clearly isn't true today. And it shapes certainly how we see the world. And as Dr. Abbott laid out some of the challenges that we're dealing with, we've been modernizing our thinking as we look at the world, but our objectives are unchanged. And for us in Canada, our first objective is to defend Canada. And we have a policy called Strong, Secure, and Engaged, and we frame that as being strong at home and secure in North America. Our second objective is to defend our Canadian interests abroad, everything from trade, security, the development of nations, whether it's through any of the DIME elements, where we can assist and do that, because we believe, if we can be far from the source of ignition, that's going to be to our benefit in the long term and to the benefit of the world. And obviously, we want to promote our international peace and security, and that means being engaged across the whole of government in the world. And certainly, Canada, as a relatively small nation compared to the United States, even the United Kingdom, as a middle power, we rely on multilateralism. We rely on organizations like the United Nations. We rely on NATO, and we rely on organizations like NORAD from a military and defense perspective to achieve these things. But as the world has changed rapidly, just one example, the growing interest in the Arctic, obviously an important region for us. There is an Arctic Council, which Canada is a member. It is a non-military council. So it deals with things that occur in the Arctic from a non-military perspective, yet we do see the growing interest from militaries in the Arctic. Is it a militarization? What does that mean for us? How would we respond to that? What is NATO's role in that? NATO has voiced interest in the Arctic. So we continue to rapidly evolve our thinking there as well. It's something we're in discussion with the United States as well, because unlike 10 to 15, 20 years ago, it is clearly now a vector for many things: economics, exploration, which exploitation follows that. But what about defense and security, and how does this all come together? So that said, the three basic principles of defending Canada, defending our interests abroad, and promoting security, development, prosperity in the world would remain unchanged. I think it's just a question of how do we deal with those factors that my colleagues have so ably discussed. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I think it's clear, first of all, there's a lot of parallelism between the national security objectives of all of our countries. And I think it's also, I'll take a great leap here to speak for the group to say that coalitions and partnerships and alliances are going to continue to play an important aspect in each of our countries' national security operations. And so with that, I'd like to skip to a question of what do you expect of a good coalition or alliance partner? And so just in general, what are the things that you expect in order to be able to work together? So let me go through and start with you, General Ormsby. Could you talk to that for us?
Absolutely. Certainly, as you mentioned in your opening, there is a technical difference, if you want to parse it out, between what an alliance is, under a treaty versus maybe a coalition that's assembled for perhaps a temporary objective, if I can use that term. Certainly in an alliance, we all have expectations, all the nations, that the member nations will live up to the treaty obligations in that. And I think, a clear example of that was 9/11, where one of our partners was attacked and we responded. We met those obligations, and we would expect our neighbors, or partners in that alliance, to do the same thing. The nurturing of that alliance through the ongoing development of information sharing, cooperation, force development, the common force development of factors such as weapons systems, communications, command and control, I think under an alliance is something that is healthy. It has to happen. It has to be forged ahead. And if that alliance, which wants to be permanent, like NATO, for example, these are necessary things that we expect to happen inside the alliance. We know there will be disagreements about the how on some of these, and that's what the various councils inside the alliance are meant to work out. But ultimately, we expect those decisions to be taken and then funded and then executed. So I think, on the ground of an alliance, I think we're on pretty sure footing, certainly with the ones that we see from a Canadian perspective. And just in the interest of time, I know you have a lot to get to, but if I could just say a coalition, just based on my personal experience, what we would expect in a coalition are nations that do participate are very clear up front about what they are willing to do and what they are not willing to do. that will allow us to plan successfully as to how they can be integrated into an operation. And an example I can give you was what the United States called Odyssey Dawn, and what NATO called Unified Protector, which was enforcing UN sanctions over Libya, the 2 UN sanctions back in 2011. There were NATO nations there, but there were also partner nations that were there. The Swedes were there, for instance, offering support, and they were, I must say, they were fantastic. They came with a clear mandate. They were highly competent. They were easily integrated into the system, even though they weren't NATO partners per se, and they performed to a very high level. So I think from a coalition perspective, that's what we're looking for. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. And Andrew, anything to add from the Australian perspective?
No, look, like Paul said, I think, countries don't go into alliances or coalition agreements lightly. There's a very serious agreement between 2 countries, and I think that's how they're viewed. I really do. But when you sign up those sort of commitments, you've got to back them, and you've got to be there. So my expectations of an alliance or a coalition is, you sign up to something, you're committed to it, and therefore if you're committed to something, you've got to invest in it. And I think that's one of the most important things with any sort of alliance or relationship. You've got to invest in it, and that means burden sharing. Each country, and this is where I think we've got to be mindful of each other's countries. Some have got greater wealth than others, some have got different expertise than others, and I think the true power of alliance is when you understand the makeup or the composition of that alliance or that coalition, and you leverage people's strengths clearly, but also you support their weaknesses. And that's often not why people have alliances, and particularly going forward. The days of someone going unilaterally in a high-end conflict, I think they're well and truly behind us. There will always be a coalition or an alliance that gives you that element of support and framework to give you that security in that environment for rules-based order and security of supply lines, etc. So that's all. I'll leave that there.
Great. Peter, anything to add?
Thank you. One of the benefits of coming last is you can listen to what everyone else has said and respond accordingly. I think there are sort of 5 things really that are key to any alliance. I think you need strong links at all levels, obviously at the military level, but also political level, diplomatic level, and even academic and cultural levels. And I think that's what makes the alliances that we have here represented really so strong. And the second thing is, I think you need common understanding and shared interests. You have to know what you're getting into an alliance for, and you have to make sure that that objective is shared. I think you need, as I think Andrew alluded to, it's a reliability and consistency and trust between the partners. They need to know that you commit to something, you're going to do it. You need that technical interoperability, which is so key. And then finally, again, Andrew's point, resource and burden sharing. Nobody wants somebody in an alliance who isn't pulling their fair share. And I think it's absolutely right that wealthier nations carry the bigger burden. But as we all know, particularly in NATO, the discussion about burden sharing has become quite political and quite difficult in recent years. But it is no less important for all of that. Thank you.
Great. And David, what do you have to add?
So I will, in the interest of time, I will just point to one other point, and that is, as partners, as we come together to a common objective in this coalition environment. And Andrew talked to the presence of individual mandates that we have in our countries. As we're pulling these things together, the understanding of all partners that we each have similar but not the same legislative and decision processes. So some of us, smaller countries, particularly where we make a contribution, that can be a significant percentage of the defence effort. So those decisions are often, at times, far more significant for a smaller defence force. So understanding that sometimes those timeframes to get to the decision point for mandates and the refreshing of mandates, it needs to be taken into consideration by larger partners.
Well, thank you, and I think all of our experience with partnerships, coalitions, alliances. There are a couple key things. One, I think, just to reinforce the idea of having a clear understanding of the capabilities of our partners is very important. In some cases, those, because of alliances and continued training and so forth, those will be well understood. But because of the pace of change, in a lot of cases, I think they may not be. So really going out of our way to understanding those capabilities is important. And another aspect is caveats. You know, a lot of times in coalition operations, countries come with certain caveats on their militaries about what they can and can't do. And having a clear understanding of what those caveats are, I've found to be very important in making sure that we assign appropriate tasks and responsibilities and so forth to various partners and to ourselves in order to take into account what the limits are on those forces. And finally, the important piece that you all kind of mentioned is the cultural piece. I have to admit, one of my biggest coalition challenges is having a Russian brigade, which probably seems kind of outrageous in today's context, but a Russian brigade was part of Multinational Division North in Bosnia. And there were some interesting cultural aspects to that relationship that we had to understand and address in order to be able to be successful. So in any coalition, of course, we're all going to bring our own cultures to the equation. So I think that that's important as well. I want to mention, I mean, we have, since we're starting to use quotes, the quote that I always like to think of is Winston Churchill's quote, where he said, "The only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them." So in that context, what are the challenges that you all see? And I'd ask you to be very candid about this. The challenges that you see in working with the United States as either an ally or a coalition partner. And what do you want us, since we have a predominantly US audience tuning in today, what do you want us to understand about the challenges of working with our forces? So let me start with the UK, since I used a UK quotation, and start with you, Peter.
Great, thank you. So, look, UK-US defence cooperation is one of, I think, possibly the most unique defence relationship in the world. It's the broadest, it's the deepest. I think it's probably the most advanced of any two nations. And you know, that kind of level of cooperation is so deep and so multifaceted and at so many levels that it survives presidencies, it survives generations, and it is really, you know, it is really so deep that it's not going to be affected by things that happen sort of on a much shorter time frame. I've seen some questions come through in the Q&A about the debate last night, and you know, the implications of that for sort of US ability to lead in the world. I wouldn't presume to make any comments. Anyone who's watched Prime Minister's Question Time in the House of Commons will know that we can be just as boisterous as our US colleagues. I think, you know, ultimately what we're looking for is continued global leadership from the US. And I think in a more specific context within NATO, it is helpful to continue to have the US pushing on burden sharing. And you know, that has been a helpful prod to a number of other nations, and I think that will continue to be important.
Great, thank you. And to our audience, just a reminder, we're going to entertain some audience questions here shortly. So if you do have a question, please make sure you type it into your Q&A box. We'll get to those in just a minute. So David, could you address that question as well?
I think what I'd like to do is point less to the current environment and maybe 5 to 10 years hence, and what does the future look like? And technology is accelerating almost at an exponential speed. As we get into future conflict, we talked about the fight that's going to be conducted both in cyber and utilizing AI and machine learning. And keeping pace with that, understanding as allies and partners the ethical, legal and moral frameworks where we will fight as a collective with our people, our systems and our equipments as nodes in an electronic battle space. There's a whole framework of understanding consensus and agreements and rules that we will need to understand before we get into that. And there's workers starting in that space. And I think all of us as likely future allies, partners and coalition members in this new warfighting environment, we all need to be in on the ground floor so that we all have a level of understanding. So I'm certainly in this role quite focused on what those next 5 years look like.
Great, thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, I must say, and I have given a bit of thought, and I think for Australia, the US is our, strongest alliance, without a doubt. And, I think what we have here in this Five Eyes community is a great network of alliances together to get, positive leadership throughout the globe. And that's where I think the US has a great role. They do play a leadership role, as we do, and as, I'll speak for myself and New Zealand in the Indo-Pacific region, we've got a regional leadership role. And so with that, I find, I was actually reflecting, what is it that other countries would want of us in our region, expect us to do? And one of the things, I suppose, is it's actually being inclusive where possible. Everyone's got national caveats and responsibilities and national, I was going to say secrets, but, things that they hold dear to themselves. And so I acknowledge that no one's going to share everything, but I think it's actually being mindful and being open as transparent as possible and explaining or contributing or bringing other nations along with them. And that's what we enjoy with the US, but it's something that we always got to continually work at. For Australia, and I mentioned about our deterrence aspect of our objectives, and we're now going into further future capabilities, long-range capabilities. So I did a quick check in the break, and we're buying up to over 60% of our capabilities come from the US. And as mentioned, we talk about emerging technologies, AI and hypersonics and the like. So my point there is what I hope we continue to do, because we are doing it, but you can always improve as a partnership, is be involved in that development at appropriate levels as we go forward. Because again, if we've got like capabilities and like-mindedness, that's actually what builds the trust and builds the relationship and the interoperability, interchangeability, and that's most important. So I'll just ask that we continue that dialogue and inclusiveness as appropriate of other allies into the journey. And I'll even go, there's so many opportunities out there, and I'll use an industry example. We look at what COVID has done of recent times, in that at the early start, it really stretched the global supply chains. And I think that's one of the things with alliances is that we should go leverage off each other. And, I think it was mentioned earlier about, alliances aren't just military, they're whole of government and whole of nation. And there's so many different aspects to it. But I think there's sort of areas where we can leverage off each other, where we've all got our own industry base. I don't think we threaten each other's industry bases or supply lines, but we should be complementing and have redundancy and a bit of increasing interdependence between each other's, including the US clearly, in that area. Thank you.
Great. And Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think my colleagues have summed up what I would have said. And, I think Peter is right on when he talks about the need for continued US leadership at the political level as much as anything else. Certainly in organizations like NATO, and then the treaty obligations it has with Southeast Asian nations as well. From a technical perspective, I thought David's point was great. Nobody is going to outspend the United States in the near future on research and development, not just on the military aspect, but in many other aspects that are going to have a military application. And it's harder for nations, certainly like Canada, to keep up with that pace of investment. So it's unlikely we're going to be producing as many new breakthrough technologies as the United States might. So I think in the context of alliances and working together, the ability to be included, as Andrew referred to, is very, very important. And that means rules around information sharing and classification, and et cetera, have to be dealt with, because again, sort of to go back to David's point, if we're all going to be allies who are nodes on this giant network of networks to deter attacks against us or to impose our will where we need it, we want to take advantage of what is leading edge technology to do that. There are offices that are working that. There's an office in the Pentagon, the Allied Prototyping Initiative, that has reached out to certain nations to seek emerging technologies in the nations and bring them online and look at how they may be invested in. And I think that's great. It's a fantastic initiative, and we need to do that. So again, all this to say, I'm just reinforcing what my colleagues have said. Our relationships are strong. There are some technical barriers we see, like information sharing. And once we have those sort of face-to-face, heart-to-heart conversations about where maybe information is getting blocked, the answer tends to be, oh yeah, I didn't realize that. What can we do to make it work? And that I found is a very notable and good sign that the relationship is strong. But sometimes the U.S. is just so big, it kind of gets in its own way, sometimes unintentionally. And so we're here to be Jiminy Cricket on the shoulder a little bit sometimes, to say, hey, don't forget, we're working on this together, and bring us in and on it. So we're with you on this. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And so I want to do the first audience question. This is from a PhD candidate in security studies. And he talks about China's rise. In you've alluded to, a couple of you have alluded to some of the Chinese activity in the region. So this is specifically for our representatives from the region, and that is there's concern, according to our PhD candidate, that traditional partners in the region may be kind of hedging their bets on China, and maybe their commitment to coalitions and partnerships is being mitigated to some degree because concern about China and the role that they may play in that region in the future. So really two questions. First of all, do you see that as a valid concern that people here in the U.S. ought to have? And has it had any effect that you can tell on nations in the region and how they might be looking at the future? So Andrew, if we could start with you.
Great question. And yes, it's something we're living with in our region. Like I said earlier, China has been more assertive. They want influence in the region. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, long as they, adhere to our global order, rules-based order, and so forth, and promote security and prosperity. That's what we want, right? But for a lot of the regions, there has been, Chinese influence in other countries. No, without a doubt, everyone knows that. And that's what I was talking before about, cohesive activities, coercive activities. They help buying, building, infrastructure support, or port support, or telecom infrastructure. They're leveraging in there. And I think these countries we're talking about, a lot of them, their culture is they may not necessarily form partnerships, they don't take sides, but they're also willing to accept support and help from other countries like China. But I think there's also though been a bit more of a realization that nothing is ever free. And I think they realize that when China or sometimes they get infrastructure support or financial support, that it comes at a cost. And I think there's a realization there amongst them. That again goes to one of our strategic objectives of shaping, is to influence and make sure countries understand what is happening in our region. and to build a secure government, or to support secure governments and democracies, or whatever form of government they have. But there has been a vacuum, I'd suggest, with attention being elsewhere. For Australia, we've focused many years now in the Middle East, and we've now got our attention fully back into our region. I think if I was, looking at the current environment of COVID, there's an opportunity here for a leadership role for many of our countries here on this panel to support these small nations post-COVID with regards to vaccination or healthcare. Because if we don't, China or someone else may do that, and then that helps and builds that reliance. So, very good question. I think it's a true statement. We've just got to be mindful of it, and our contribution is that leadership and actually helping those minor countries, smaller countries, navigate their way through this and see what the long-term goal is of security and prosperity.
David, anything to add?
Thank you. Fantastic and insightful question. I think we do need to acknowledge that that a lot of those countries in the region are hedging their bets. I think we need to acknowledge that many of them are looking at this through a whole of nation prosperity lens, because they have China as a significant trade partner. They can't unilaterally step to another trading partner if that door to China was to close for some of them. I think we do have a role in doing two things. One, not directing the activities of other nations, but helping them to be informed and to be aware of some of those influencing activities of a variety of nations. And I think we need to, and Andrew certainly pointed to it, in terms of support, we can't just say a small nation or a nation in the region shouldn't accept a particular relationship with a larger partner. We need to be able to fill that gap. So you can't just say no, you've got to say, we are a viable alternative, and here is how we can be there.
Great, thank you. Another audience question, and I know each of you had to have seen this coming. The president has clearly made burden sharing an important aspect of partnership with the United States, but I think this is a great question. What is a fair defense budget among partners and allies? And that's, I think, a great question. Is a percentage of GDP the right measure? And what, if not, what is the appropriate measure of what a fair defense budget is? So why don't we start with Peter? Why don't you lead us off on that?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer to it. Maybe some of my colleagues do. I would say, percent of GDP is probably the best, easiest, most straightforward and understandable way of doing it, but I can see that it does highlight some inequities. The UK contributes 0.7% of GNP to international development assistance. And that was based on a formula that was developed 40 or 50 years ago. And we have not been able to change that formula or to do it in a way that's sort of garnered widespread support. So when you start to sort of unpick some of these things, you realize actually quite how complicated it is. So I'm listening keenly to any ideas from other colleagues for how we might do this on the defense sphere. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. This is a question that certainly our politicians have been wrestling with for some time. I mean, the 2% target that was set in Wales in 2015, I think, was a formalization of discussions that have been going on for decades about what it should be, and not to explain it away. I think Wales was, the intent to get to 2%. Certainly in Canada, we have not reached 2%. I think our planned budgetary expenditures in the next 10 years, I'm just going from memory now, will get us to 1.47%, I think it is, I could be wrong, so please don't quote me on that. I'll have to check the numbers. But I think from our perspective, it's about also the quality of the contribution and where it's contributed. And Canada certainly has been on every NATO mission. We have not the largest force, but we have one of the finest forces in the world. And, we're presently in Romania, we're in Eastern Europe, we're in South Pacific presently, in the Mediterranean. So we see ourselves as a nation that can be relied on when NATO needs partners to be there to actually operate. So it's a question I'll leave to the politicians to work out as to what is the best formula to do it. All I can tell you is that for those of us who are in uniform, when the call comes, we're going to be there. Thanks.
Great, thanks. David, any other thoughts?
Interestingly, percentage of GDP is something that generally we have to go away and calculate every time the question is asked. The number for New Zealand sits at about 1.3%, but actually the narrative at home is about effect, being a valued partner, and what can we contribute. So it's about what we bring to the table, and what that costs is something that is, arguably less of a concern in terms of the broader defence budget. I think also we need to be very cautious about comparing apples with bananas, because I think what makes up a defence budget is very different in each of our nations. Even between Australia and New Zealand, we have different inputs into that broader defence measure. It's also interesting to note, there's the defence budget for operating, and then there's the defence budget for capital acquisitions. So in the past 18 months, New Zealand's contributed or committed to nearly 6% of an annual GDP in capital acquisitions into the US. So those are, at a national perspective, are very significant investments.
Right. Thank you for that. And Andrew, any comments that you might have?
No, look, it is a good question, and I think it's something that's been spoken about for many years, and it's been touched on there, the fact that how does a country calculate their contributions to GDP, defence spending, and there's different ways of doing it. It does include veteran affairs, does it include operations, acquisition, etc., etc. But that said, I think, like anything, you do need a benchmark, you do need a target that everyone with flexibility can at least have some sort of gauge and benchmark to compare to, or show that their commitment or value of their commitment is. If you didn't have a benchmark of some sort, a target of some sort, then I think you'd have nothing, and I think you'd have no control or no comparison at all. In that respect, I think, once again, money is a good indicator, and it's relative to a country's economy, if they use a percentage. But obviously that's not for us to decide. But I will close on saying that Australia has been hitting, or did this year, 2% GDP spend on defence, which is good for us, and that's something we use internally, that we want to achieve this. But again, I don't know so much it's the percentage that we're driving our spend to meet that benchmark, but rather what capabilities do we need, and how we're going to introduce them into service. So I think it's basically needs will determine it.
Yeah. First of all, I agree that is a great question, and I think your points are very well made. Even here in the United States, trying to calculate how much are we spending on defense is a very difficult question to answer. Does foreign military assistance, for instance, where we provide assistance to countries for various pieces of equipment or capability, does that count as part of the defense piece of this? Because it's actually our Department of State that runs that. And so forth. And so, what kind of investments really fall into security investments? So how do you do that calculus? So it is a very complicated question, and thank you all for those insights. So here's another question, and I'll apologize to our audience up front that we're not going to get to all of your questions. They are all very good. But very briefly, I think this is a great one. Talk to the U.S. audience about how does a global approach to security benefit the average U.S. citizen from your all's perspective. Can you comment on that, please? And let's start, Paul. Could you give us a couple highlights up front?
So it's interesting. I was in the Middle East around Christmas time, and I was talking with some of the people that live in Jordan and some of the countries, and they said, you know what, we're a 4,000-year-old civilization, yet we're a developing country, and the reason is conflict. It's hard to establish prosperity when there's conflict and constant tension. So a very simple answer, and I hope it doesn't come across too shallow, but if we can have a world in which there is stability, maybe not always peace, but certainly stability and good relations, that is to the benefit of everybody. It allows prosperity, it allows economic growth, it allows cultural growth, it allows for nations to develop, to remove the stressors that are putting them in conflict. It's a very big answer to a very big series of large problems, everything from water rights to mineral rights to religious issues, etc. But we certainly approach it, if we can de-escalate situations through development, through engagement, before they get to the point of armed conflict, we have actually achieved something very strong. So that is the intent. So a world that is peaceful, a world that is calm and tranquil, or at least stable, will provide enormous benefits to all of us. That would be my answer.
Well, thank you for that. And I have to say, our time has gone by so quickly. And that's one of the great things about being in person, is after we have a panel, we have a great opportunity for audience members to continue the dialogue that we won't be able to have today. I will say to Stephen, on your specific question to me, if you want to contact the World Affairs Council Connecticut and they can connect us, I'd be happy to talk to you about that, one-on-one. But first of all, for each of our panel members, I want to thank you for your participation today and your insights. I appreciate your candid views and also for the terrific partnership. I have never deployed anywhere when it hasn't been side by side and working with all of your countries. And that includes, General Walker in the ARC. It includes Walt Natansky when we went to Iraq. It includes Special Forces with New Zealand, very capable young soldiers. It includes my great deputy at U.S. Central Command from Australia, Mike Crane. So I can just tell you that we're grateful as a nation to all of you and what you contribute to our collective security. And we look forward to a great relationship continuing down the road. And with that, the last thing is, again, thank you to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut for hosting this forum, and look forward to continuing to participate. Thank you all. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, General Jones. And once again, masterful moderating. We're so grateful to you. We're so grateful to Commodore Gibbs and Generals Freeman and Ormsby and Consul General Abbott for being with us here today to discuss how we work together to build a more prosperous, tranquil, and peaceful world. This has been such an incredible panel. I can't thank all of you enough. We are so grateful. And I just want to put in a plug for our next session, which is Battlefronts. We'll be discussing some of our greatest security threats. And also, I know a lot of you had mentioned sort of high-tech warfare, AI, machine learning, autonomous weapons systems. I encourage anyone who sort of is interested in that, or cares about how we're going to be defending and equipping our troops in the future, to join us tomorrow at noon for a talk with Christian Brose on his book, The Kill Chain. It is an amazing book, and anyone who cares about our future, defending our future, should really tune in. To get more information, to revisit this conversation, please go to gsf2020.com. Again, gsf2020.com, and to revisit any conversation that we're having during the Global Security Forum this week. Thank you again to all of you, and you all have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.